They took everything from him: his throne, his empire, his army, his name scraped from the monuments of a continent he had personally redrawn. They put him on a ship, sailed him past the edge of the known world, and told themselves it was over. It was not over. Because you cannot exile what a man has already become, and Napoleon Bonaparte had already become something history had no category for. In the entire sweep of modern history, no single figure has been exiled, returned, conquered, exiled again, and still managed to shake the foundations of every empire that opposed him, quite like Napoleon Bonaparte. This is not a story about a man who lost. It's a story about what losing revealed, about what their enemies discovered too late when they tried to bury a force of nature in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Call to action. If you believe that history only remembers those who never fell, stay until the final minute of this video, because Napoleon fell twice, and the world was never the same after either fall. Subscribe now and follow every chapter of a man the entire civilized world could not permanently defeat. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Corsica, an island that had been transferred from the Republic of Genoa to France just 1 year before his birth. He was, in the most literal sense, barely French. He arrived in a country that was not quite his, speaking a language with a foreign accent, carrying the name of an island that most Parisians could barely locate on a map. He enrolled at the military academy at Brienne at age 9. He was mocked for his accent, his short stature, and his Corsican origins. His classmates called him the foreigner. He responded the only way he knew how, by outworking every one of them. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon was a 20-year-old artillery officer with a mind that his own commanding officers described as dangerous in its clarity. He did not see chaos the way other men did. He saw opportunity. In 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, a Mediterranean port city that had surrendered to British forces, Napoleon proposed a bold, unorthodox artillery strategy that his superiors initially dismissed. They eventually approved it. Within days, the British were driven from the harbor. Napoleon was 24 years old. He was promoted to brigadier general on the battlefield. France took notice. By 1796, he was given command of the Army of Italy, a starving, under-equipped, demoralized force that had not achieved a significant victory in years. Napoleon addressed them directly. He told them he would lead them into the most fertile plains in the world. He told them glory and honor awaited them. He was 26 years old and had never commanded an army in the field. In the next 12 months, he defeated the Austrian Empire in 14 engagements. He signed treaties. He redrew borders. He sent wagon loads of Italian art and gold back to Paris. He did not ask permission for any of it. In 1799, France was politically fractured, economically exhausted, and losing its revolutionary wars on multiple fronts. Napoleon returned from his Egyptian campaign, orchestrated a coup on the 18th of Brumaire, and within days was installed as first consul of France, the effective ruler of the most powerful republic on earth. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Pope Pius VII traveled from Rome to attend. At the moment of coronation, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head himself. The message was unmistakable. No man had given him this power. No man could take it. The coalition against Napoleon was not built in a single day. It was assembled, dismantled, rebuilt, and reassembled across more than a decade by Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and virtually every established monarchy in Europe. They feared him not simply because he won wars. They feared him because every country he touched was reorganized, reformed, and dragged, often violently, into the modern world. His legal code, the Napoleonic Code, abolished feudalism. It guaranteed property rights, established civil equality, and became the legal foundation of dozens of nations, including many that fought against him. His enemies recognized, even as they opposed him, that he carried within him the ideas of an age they could not stop. But Napoleon carried within him a fatal contradiction. The man who had risen by reading every situation with cold precision began to misread the most important ones. In 1812, against the counsel of his most trusted marshals, he invaded Russia with the Grande Armée, approximately 685,000 men, the largest military force assembled in European history to that point. The Russians did not meet him in a decisive battle. They retreated. They burned their own fields, their own cities, their own supplies. They left Napoleon nothing to conquer and nothing to eat. The French reached Moscow in September. The city was already burning, set alight by the Russians themselves. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for 35 days for the Russian Tsar to send peace envoys. No one came. The retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812 was one of the most catastrophic military disasters in recorded history. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Men froze in their uniforms. Horses died by the thousands. Of the nearly 685,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned in any condition to fight. Europe's monarchies, watching the collapse, mobilized with a coordinated ferocity they had never managed before. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, the armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden converged on Napoleon with over 380,000 troops. It was the largest battle fought in European history before the 20th century. Napoleon lost. By March 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. Napoleon's own marshals refused to fight on. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated the throne of France for the first time. He was 44 years old. The terms of his exile were, by historical standards, remarkably generous, and their enemies would spend the rest of their lives regretting it. He was granted sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor. He was given a pension and a personal guard of 600 men. They sent him to an island 11 miles wide and told themselves it was over. Napoleon arrived on Elba in May 1814. He was watched but not imprisoned. He was diminished but not destroyed. To most of Europe, the chapter was closed. The great disruption of the age had been contained on a Mediterranean island smaller than many French counties. He reformed its tax system. He built roads. He organized a small navy. He drilled his 600 guards as if they were the vanguard of the Grande Armée. Observers who visited the islands reported back to Paris that he seemed content, domesticated, finished. They were watching what they wanted to see, not what was actually there. Napoleon was watching France, and France was unraveling. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was deeply unpopular. Soldiers who had fought under Napoleon's eagles were being passed over in favor of royalist officers who had spent the revolution in comfortable exile. The peasantry, which had gained land rights under Napoleon's legal reforms, feared those rights would be reversed. Veterans of the Grande Armée, men who had crossed the Alps, fought in Egypt, held the line at Austerlitz, were being pensioned off and ignored. Napoleon received these reports. He processed them with the same cold, analytical intelligence that had built his empire. He made his calculations. On the night of February 26, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte boarded a ship with approximately 1,050 men, his personal guard and a handful of volunteers, and sailed from Elba toward the coast of France. He had informed no one. He had received no invitation. He had no diplomatic backing, no foreign ally, no guarantee of any kind. He was betting everything on a single belief: that France would remember him. When he landed near Antibes on March 1, 1815, the local garrison was sent to arrest him. He walked toward them alone, unarmed, and opened his coat to expose his chest. He said, according to accounts recorded by witnesses, "If any of you wishes to shoot your emperor, Here I am." Not a shot was fired. The soldiers joined him. This scene repeated itself, garrison by garrison, regiment by regiment, across the entire south of France, as Napoleon walked north toward Paris. The king sent Marshal Ney, one of the most celebrated soldiers in French history, with explicit orders to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. Ney met Napoleon at Auxerre, reviewed the ground his old soldiers held, and switched sides. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte entered Paris. Louis XVIII had fled the city that morning. The Bourbon monarchy had dissolved without a single engagement. In 20 days, without firing a shot, the exiled emperor had walked back into his capital and reclaimed the most powerful throne in Europe. The powers of Europe did not negotiate. They did not deliberate. Within days of Napoleon's return, the major European powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, declared him an outlaw, an enemy of civilization, and mobilized their armies. Napoleon understood that his window was narrow. He needed to defeat the gathering coalition forces before they could fully concentrate. He moved first. In the Belgian campaign of June 1815, he drove his army north at extraordinary speed, defeating the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher at the Battle of Ligny on June 16. It was a significant victory. 2 days of maneuvering remained before the decisive engagement. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon's army engaged the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces at a ridge south of Brussels, near a small village called Waterloo. The battle lasted 9 hours. Wellington's forces held their ground through repeated French assaults. Late in the afternoon, as Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard, the most elite infantry in Europe, men who had never broken in battle, in a final push to break the Allied center, the Prussians arrived on the French right flank. They had regrouped faster than Napoleon's intelligence had indicated. The Imperial Guard, struck simultaneously from 2 directions, broke for the first and only time in its history. The French army collapsed. Napoleon left the field in his carriage under darkness. He returned to Paris and abdicated a second time on June 22, 1815. He was 55 days into what history would call the 100 Days. This time, his enemies took no chances. There would be no Elba, no Mediterranean island, no 600 guards, no pension, no title. Napoleon was transported to St. Helena, a volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,400 miles from the coast of Africa, more than 4,000 miles from France. It was the most remote inhabited island on Earth. The British stationed a naval squadron permanently around it. There was no harbor that could conceal a rescue ship. He arrived in October 1815, and he never left. Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena on May 5, 2021. He was 51 years old. The official cause of death recorded by the British was stomach cancer. French physicians who later examined his remains disputed this. The controversy continues. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs, carefully, deliberately, strategically, constructing the version of himself that he intended history to receive. He succeeded. The Napoleon of popular imagination, the meritocratic general, the legal reformer, the defender of revolutionary ideals against the reactionary monarchies of Europe, is substantially the Napoleon that Napoleon built on St. Helena. 19 years after his death, in 1840, the French government negotiated the return of his remains from St. Helena. His coffin was brought up the Seine River to Paris on a winter day. 1 million people stood in the streets to watch it pass. France had a king at the time. The king watched from a window. Napoleon's legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code, remain the foundation of the legal systems of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, and more than 50 nations across 5 continents. His reorganization of French education created the lycée system that still exists today. His restructuring of the French banking system established institutions that operated for over a century. The monarchies that exiled him twice did not outlast him by nearly as long as they assumed they would. The Habsburg Empire fell in 1918. The Romanov dynasty fell in 1917. The Hohenzollerns fell in 1918. The restored Bourbon monarchy of France lasted 15 years before it was overthrown in 1830. Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled twice. He was defeated in the field. He was imprisoned on a rock in the South Atlantic until he died. His enemies controlled the narrative for decades after his death, framing him as a tyrant, a warmonger, a threat to the peace of Europe. And yet, his name is among the most recognized in the world. His battles are studied in every military academy on Earth. His code governs the legal lives of hundreds of millions of people. His face is one of the most reproduced in human history. They exiled the emperor. History exiled his enemies. The man they could never quite defeat is still, 2 centuries after his death, reshaping the conversation about power, genius, ambition, and what it means to rise from nothing and make the entire world take notice. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the measure of a man is not in how many times he falls, but in what he builds every time he rises, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the people history remembers are rarely the ones who played it safe. The next chapter is coming. Do not miss it.